Welcome to Gracefully Graying. I am your host, Attorney Henry Gornbein. I'm pleased to say that Gracefully Graying is now being shot at Bloomfield Cablevision. It is also available on my YouTube channel, the Henry Gornbein channel. Every week on Gracefully Graying, I'm exploring issues that we face aimed at the demographics 50 and over, or with aging parents, looking at things from medical, legal, economic, social, physical, and psychological perspectives. Today on Gracefully Graying, I am pleased to welcome as my guest Paula Duren, who has a passionate career on training caregivers, basically for end of life. So Paula, welcome to Gracefully Graying.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
First of all, why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about your background and who you are?
Well, I'm one of 6 siblings. Both of my parents died from dementia-related diseases. I'm a psychologist by training, and used to do a lot of work in the area of change management, executive coaching, until my parents became ill. And at that point, I decided that we needed to transition. I basically stepped off of the world and then said, I'm going to care for my parents. So that made a huge change and transition in my life. So psychologist in corporate, doing all the work of a corporate psychologist, then moving into this caregiver space, which is absolutely marvelous.
So this has become your passion?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm learning, especially as we're gracefully graying, that to successfully navigate this chapter of our lives, it's important to have a passion. It could be someone who wants to stay home and read or do crossword puzzles, or someone who wants to play golf as much as possible, but it's important to have a passion and purpose. So tell us a little bit about exactly what you have a nonprofit, exactly what is it and how did you start it?
The nonprofit is Universal Dementia Caregivers, and we're about 4 years old right now, and we're grant funded. Always looking for donations, so we'll just put that plug out there. What we do is, when Mom and Dad became ill, one of the things that was very clear to me is there were not enough resources out there for the caregiver. There were lots of resources to care for the loved one with the disease. Mom had Alzheimer's and Dad had vascular. And in the process of loving on them and caring for them, I was looking for resources that would help me manage. Because as you know, the caregiver sometimes dies before the person that they're loving on.
It's true. And
so wanted to make sure we were doing the best we could, did everything we could. Lots of issues popped, and we'll talk about some of those. So as a result of that, I started this, I kept a journal. And this journal kind of was my place for recording things and keeping things in line. And then at some point I said, let me read this and see what it sounds like. I read my journal. Henry, it was sad. It was angry. It was all of the stuff I was carrying inside, my way of letting it out. But I believe that sometimes we go through things that are purely for us. They're for our learning and for our growth. But I also think that sometimes we go through things for other people. So you didn't ask for this, but I'm going to share where this really came from.
Please do. Okay.
I laid down that night and I prayed, and I just said, if this is something, this area of dementia, something you really want me to do, I prayed to God and I says, give me a title, give me something to convey to me that this is important. And so I put the notepad next to the bed, like you do when you're kind of thinking about stuff in the middle of the night. And by morning, I had a vision of my title, and the title was, My Lights Are Going Out, But It's Not Dark in Here. And I had the visual, and I had 7 care strategies. So we are now in our second phase of my lights are going out. It's now flowers. And so we can talk about that later, but it became very clear to me this was important for everyone out there to know, how do you manage dementia-related diseases from the caregiver's perspective, where you care for the heart and the spirit of the loved one and not just their bodies.
Well, Paula, you do a lot of lecturing. And I guess you're the guru of training caregivers.
Oh, thank you.
But why don't you tell us a little bit about how your program works? How do you train caregivers? Because it's hard. I mean,
yeah.
You're giving love, you're sharing, and you're also learning that you're helping someone transist to the end of life.
Yes.
So you're not only impacting on the person whose lights are dimming, especially with Alzheimer's and dementia, but also dealing with family members who have to adjust to this as well.
Absolutely.
So it's such a really a critical role.
You have gave me such a loaded question. Let me just go see if I can parse
I'm
it
a
out.
lawyer. What do you expect?
Absolutely. There are 5 parts to that question, you know, Henry. Well, let me start with, first of all, what we try to do is reframe the negative picture that people automatically experience when they hear the word Alzheimer's or dementia. The first thing they think about is deficit and what they can no longer do and that they're going to transition and die. Well, little known fact, we're all in the process of transitioning and dying.
Sure.
So the issue is, if I can help them reframe to say, stop looking at the things they're losing, start focusing on the gifts that still remain. Because if I have this frame all the time that they lost this, they lost that, and they are losing some things, but they're still inside. And that's what I need to stress. The loved one is still inside. They need the same love. They have the same human needs as you do right now, but they no longer can express them. But what if I train my caregivers to focus on meeting that unmet need? And then how good they would feel when they saw the person benefiting or enjoying. And let me just, simple example. One of my care strategies is comfort me with touch. What we have learned is that seniors, well, babies get all kind of touch. Everybody loves babies and they make us stupid, basically. But what happens is that as the child ages, they get less and less touch. So by the time they're seniors or older adults, they get virtually no touch unless it's directed at a task. Meaning, I'm going to help you up, I'm going to bathe you, I'm going to feed you. Rarely do we get, I'm invading your personal space.
Touching is important.
Rarely do we just touch each other to communicate love and caring and connection. So my philosophy is, you have to connect to the human inside of them, because they still need to be touched, they still need to be cared for, they need to be taken. It's just so human. It's almost like we're reconnecting to our humanness as we deal with the pain and loss at the same time.
Thinking of touching, and what about pets, dogs in this role? Or
yes.
Especially dogs. I mean, cats to a lesser degree. Cats, I like dogs and cats. I'm more of a dog person. And cats, they'll let you touch them. It's almost as if they're doing the favor, whereas a dog
yes.
wants to be touched.
Yes. Animals have such an approving way about them. You can be mean to a dog, and within a few minutes, the dog is back looking for approval and connection.
Sure.
And I think you know that hospitals have dogs that they take into various places because people love animals. And it's also that connection. We have to feel like something is there for us. Somebody's there to connect with us. So it's the foundation of our program is the human touch, or the connection and communication. We need people to talk to us. And then people will say, well, they don't understand. How do you know they don't understand? Maybe the issue is you don't understand the message they're sending back to you. Because the issue is they communicate, our loved ones living with dementia-related diseases, but not in the language that we understand. So we're so used to having a dialogue like this.
Sure.
What if you were to able to communicate with your loved one and you saw that little smile, or you saw that eye movement that told you that was connection?
So we've got to look for very subtle signs, especially if someone is more advanced.
Yes, it's called being a great detective. And I am a detective with someone I love. And you're already investing the time. Why don't you get rewarded in the same way? But hear me, the challenge to caregivers is, though, some of them make that role their lives. And I understand it, because if it's your wife, we're reared to take care of each other. But the issue is, in order for you to live, and them to live comfortably, you need to live. You've got to take care of yourself. And we're whole people. We've got care. I'm a spiritual person, I'm a physical person, I'm a social person, I'm a whole person. And when I become a caregiver, we forget about all of those dimensions. We take our loved one to the doctor and forget to take our medication. We bathe, we make sure that they eat properly, but then we eat whatever's left over. We have to make ourselves a priority, because if we're a priority, we are then there to care for them as they move forward with their disease.
So I think an important message for our viewers is the fact that to be a good caregiver, you also got to be a caretaker of yourself as well.
Yes. And Henry, I think you know, most of us know what to do. We know how to exercise. We know how to get on a treadmill. It's not an issue of knowledge. And oftentimes it's not an issue of capacity. Then what stops us? What stops us from 30 minutes a day taking care of ourselves? The excuse is we don't have time. You don't have time for you? So I challenge people who say, I don't have time to take care of myself.
You make time. I mean, it's a matter, people don't prioritize well.
Right.
And it's like, it's important to eat properly, it's important to exercise, it's important to get sleep. These are things I'm learning through a lot of these shows, and people fail to do this in many respects.
And one of the things you asked me about is about becoming a caregiver. Many of us become a caregiver out of need and necessity. Most of us family caregivers did not go to school to become caregivers. And so we find ourselves in a place that either no one else wants to do it, or no one else is willing to step up and do it. And what we're finding is the majority of our caregivers are women who are stepping up to take it, family caregivers. Oftentimes they're women, the highest percentage, and they're caring for typically a family member, and they oftentimes will dedicate their lives, oftentimes leaving their jobs, because they don't have time. But to truly be a caregiver, you have to start by accepting the role. Because if you don't accept the role that this is who I am, some people say, well, all I do is go get groceries, or all I do is this. I am a believer that you are a caregiver, and accept the role of a caregiver. And then as you progress and the loved one progresses with their disease, you're more accepting of what you need to do to help take care of them. And it's funny, I was telling someone the other day, one of the things you find out in families in particular, because you mentioned families in your question, is that if a family has issues, I want you to know when someone gets sick with some type of terminal disease, those issues present themselves.
They get worse. I mean, I'm finding, because in the area of, my specialty in law has always been family law and divorce, and it's like good people on their worst behavior, but I'm also finding that often with end-of-the-life issues, especially if people have different viewpoints,
yes,
or especially if there's money involved, it can be just as nasty as any divorce or as a bunch of children fighting in a playground.
Yes, and that's why I stress in our training that people people need to get their paperwork right. They need to know who will take care of them, who will have power of attorney, do we have a living will, all the stuff that you talk to clients about. Because if you have those items in place, at the transition point where I'm preparing to die, we don't have to talk about, well, who's going to get this or who's going to get that. I supported a family once, and they invited, mom was in transition at the hospital in hospice, and they invited me to just be there with them. And so in being with the family, I left the room, and one of the family members ran out and said, Mom's crying. Mom's really kind of out of it at this point. I said, she's crying. So tears were running down her face. And so I called a physician in, because I know my place. I'm a psychologist. I called a physician in, and I asked him to evaluate and make sure she was okay. He said, no, she's fine. When he left the room, I asked the family, what were you all talking about? They were talking about her stuff and who was going to get what.
So they already had put her into the grave, for lack of a better word. And
forgot that hearing is the last gift to leave. And you're having a conversation of that nature, and she was pained. And so if you have that stuff already worked out, and I know I tell people, if you have $2 over your funeral, somebody's going to fight over it.
That's true.
And it's so important for clarity, and that's not to say they still won't fight, but at least you have a foundation of knowledge and a good attorney that can support whatever was the wishes of the loved one, which is key.
Paula, how do you get people to talk? Because one of the things that a lot of people are ostriches, and I'm thinking, one example is Aretha Franklin. She didn't do a will. Elvis didn't do a will. Prince didn't do a will. Right. Michael Jackson. I mean, it goes on and on. Right. These are people who should have had very complex estate plans, but they fail to do so, and it's true with a lot of celebrities. And one of the hardest conversations it is where children and parents talk about taboos. Money's a taboo. Death is something that's hard to talk about. What type of funeral do you want? I mean, why not talk about things while you're still able to do so? So how do you get them to do this?
Well, I think starting out, the acknowledgement that it's a hard conversation.
Yes, it is.
And many seniors don't want you to know their business.
Right.
And many family members are afraid if we have the conversation, you're going to die. There's this strange notion around, if I actually have the conversation about death, they're going to die. And my reaction is, well, you know my reaction at this point.
Right.
They're going to die anyway. Let's make sure that the transition is as smooth as possible. In our training program, we have a partnership with Wayne State, and they have a program called SAFE. And they will help you learn how to have a conversation, walk you through strategic strategies on how you actually talk about money. How do you talk about the last days? How do you transition so you can get support for that? But the other part of it is you have to be willing to take the risk and try it. Well, it may not come out right. Okay, try it again another way. Try it again another way. At some point, the conversation may work. I was, again, I don't know if you don't mind stories, but I was invited into a family, and the family really just needed to talk. And so one of the family members, there was a mom and 3 stepchildren. Dad's sick. Dad has Alzheimer's. And he is now in a center just for temporary time because he's become aggressive. Mom's afraid of him. So the kids are like, you're just trying to put him away. What are you doing just trying to put him away? So one of the things we talked about is they needed to get some exposure to Dad when he's angry. The girls didn't know anything about how Dad was doing in terms of the behavioral formats that were happening. So there was a weekend where stepmom, asked them to keep him for the weekend.
Okay.
The girls came back with such an amazing insight into Dad and the challenges that stepmom was dealing with. They finally said, we'll talk. Sometimes you've got to find creative ways to get people to understand what's going on. And in the conversation, they acknowledged they did not realize the things that the stepmom was going through to take care of their father.
Before we started the show, we talked about the fact that our society is not one of the best as far as how we treat our aging population.
Yeah, you're right.
And I'd argue we don't do a good job medically. We often tend to warehouse people, and whereas in some societies, and I'm using China as an example, the elderly are revered. What would your response be to that? First of all, do you agree with what I'm saying?
I agree that how we treat our older adults has got to get better. But then it's not just older adults. We're missing basic civility in this country. And I'm thinking right now, we're just mean to each other.
Well, it's horrible. I mean, I was in court this morning, and, you know, the judge started addressing one of the attorneys because the attorney was not being civil to the other attorney.
Okay.
And it turns into, and this has become a big issue between attorneys and judges. There's a total lack of civility. Well, our whole society is breaking down, for lack of a better word.
So in response to your question about how we engage our loved ones, our seniors, I think oftentimes that's how they're treated as a reflection of what our world is like, too. There was a time our elderly were cared for in a lot different manner, but now it's very different than it was. I was going to tell you when we were talking about aggressive behaviors, sometimes it presents itself. There are a number of behaviors that as the loved one makes that, since dementia-related diseases are progressive in nature, they'll start at one place and they're going to progress. That oftentimes we're confronted as caregivers with really, really tough behaviors.
And what are some of them? Give us some examples. Because that's an important issue.
One of them might be wandering. So what happens in Michigan if your loved one gets out of the house and you don't know where they are? First of all, you're panic-stricken, but they could die very easily because of the cold. So wandering might be one. It might be accusations. They might accuse you of stealing. And you know what your first response is when I say, Henry, you're stealing my money. Come on, go with me. What would you say?
Well, isn't it going to be mine eventually? No.
That was great. That was good.
You know, I'd say no, of course not. Your money's there for you, and I'm not.
I saw you stealing my money, and not only are you stealing my money, you're stealing my clothes too. And let me tell you, the natural response of any human is to defend themselves. Well, you can't, remember, I have a brain disease, and you're coming at me with very reasonable, rational conversations. I've got a brain disease. you don't attend to the accusation because now I'm protecting myself. You go with, well, what makes you feel like that? Or what are you experiencing? Because what's happening is there's something going wrong for them at that moment, and they need you to be that detective and pay attention to what I might be feeling. So the other thing, as we talked about wandering, people, I was an adult, say that would jog every day. Now I have Alzheimer's, and you think I'm doing well when I'm just sitting down doing nothing. Well, if I had a need to exercise before, I still have that need to exercise. That
Right.
doesn't go away. What we need to do is give them space and opportunity to do something that's within their physical capability at this point. But too often we think as long as they're quiet, they're fine. No, I say keep them engaged as long as possible with any of these behaviors.
So you want to give people options.
Yes.
You want to, it's like when one door closes, another opens. So you want to keep as many doors open as possible. But I guess another thought is, I often use an analogy in the area of family law because it's like I may see something with a mirror that's clear. The other party is especially if someone where there's some severe psychological issues, his or her mirror is distorted. But that's his or her reality. And I think the same analogy works when you're looking at Alzheimer's or dementia.
Right, right. That's correct. And so one of the reasons I say you don't try and be reasonable and rational in your explanations, you have to remember I have a brain disease. And the brain disease, you need to see the world from where I am. So I need you to come, stop trying to pull me back into your world and be reasonable and rational, and you come into my space.
But that's going to be very, very difficult.
Yes. It's difficult, but you have to do it because otherwise, how are you going to support the person? Take, for example, at some phase in the dementia journey, there might be a time where they engage with the television. They might be watching TV, and then watching TV, they become frightened that somebody's getting ready to kill them and all that kind of stuff. Well, once you observe that, part of your role is not to say, Ma, there's nothing up there. That's only the television. It's not, you know, that reasonable, rational conversation we have with
Right.
people? What you do is you change the channel. You find other things that are more peaceful to put into their spirit. The issue is one of my roles as a caregiver is to ensure that the environment is healthy enough for you to be okay. In a funny story, it's not my story, a girlfriend said this. She said her mom was watching TV one night and it was like robbers and killers and police, and then they went to church the next day and she went over to the pastor, the mom did, my daughter had some men at the house last night and they were shooting and cussing and so I said, what a great story. The issue was, and the pastor understood, that's the wonderful thing. We need to get that stuff out of their space and manage knowing the impact of that stuff on your spirit.
So you really have to, you want to filter the environment. You want to create an environment that's as peaceful and loving as possible.
Yes, yes. Creating a space where they can thrive even though dementia is taking parts of their capacity away. I read the other day about a program, I think it's in Europe. It's called, they have dementia communities, where the community is set up so that people with dementia can thrive, where they can go and come as they need to, but it's all protected. But they have people around them that know how to pay attention to the person who is. One of our motto as an organization, I brought you a copy of this. Our motto is honor who they were, love who they are, and welcome who they become. Because it is a transition, and we have to prepare for it.
There's some other things that I want you to, what is to be?
To be, interesting you asked that. We created a model, and I wanted to show you this. One of the things that happens when people, as we say, they have challenging behaviors. And I'm going to call them challenging, but they're challenging because we don't know how to deal with them. And we started talking about them. Some of them are wandering, sundowning, the anger, the agitation. And I said, well, let's create a tool. So I created this tool on how you handle challenging behaviors. But it starts with a model. And the model says you have to start with simply being present. If I were in the back room, you'd see mom's in the back room, and you heard this scream, just this huge scream. What happens in your energy right then? You heard the scream, what do you do?
I think I'd get up and run in there to find out what's going on.
That's correct. And what happened in your energy first is that you panicked. At the point you panic, that brought in a certain amount of energy all by itself, right? Now you're at the door, you're in a state of panic, you're worried because you're supposed to be worried, and you just brought that into the room of someone who has Alzheimer's. I say before you go in the room,
Count to 10, take a deep breath.
Simply be present. Because if you walked in now, if there were a robber in there, you wouldn't see them. You'd be so focused on mom, they'd knock you in the head anyway. So you need to just walk in the room and be present. Paul, how's that possible? As you said, count to 10. I tell you to just simply stop at the door, breathe, and say, I need to be present, and not take this energy in there, because my energy would scare them anyway at this point.
It's true.
So what I did was add anxiety to anxiety. So if I can get caregivers to just simply be present and in the room, it relaxes them, and then they bring the right energy in the room with their loved one. So that's when I say I need my caregivers to learn how to simply be present at that moment.
Paula, we're down to probably 2 minutes or less.
Oh, you're kidding.
Well, you're great, and there's so much more I want to cover, but I'd like you to give us 3 takeaways for our viewers that you think are important before we sign off on our show.
3 takeaways about caregiving in general, but dementia in particular. One is we have to learn to care for ourselves. We have really got to learn how to care for ourselves. And to me, that's key, because a healthy caregiver brings healthy care. An unhealthy caregiver provides unhealthy care. So I want to keep you alive as long as possible, and present an attitude of gratitude, because people who are excited about life bring a whole different spirit into the room. I would also say that you have the healthy brain. You have to remember that when you're engaging someone with this rationale that makes sense to you, you need to slow down, get into their space, look at what might be causing the behavior versus reacting to the behavior. You're important to the transition, and I'd say touch their humanness. See, flowers is the tool we put together that focuses on comfort me with touch, use music, help me remember, help me feel safe, address the stigma that's on me at this point. I need you to learn strategies that reconnects to their heart and their spirit. You know how to take care of their bodies, but do you really know how to connect with them? Because at the moment you know how to connect with them, your energy and your worry, your pain, your frustration starts to diminish too. One thing my mother told me, she says, I don't know who you are, but I love your spirit.
Paula, this is wonderful. I mean, we're down to 30 seconds, and I want to thank you so much for being my guest on Gracefully Graying. And I also want to share with our viewers that this is something that I'm trying to build as a resource and community for all of the issues that we face as we're going into some of the final chapters of our lives. And so if you have thoughts, guests, ideas, please contact me or contact the studio. And again, it's Gracefully Graying. I want to thank you so much for watching. And Paula, it's been a pleasure having you as my guest.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thank you.